So one of the things that we are going to do a lot of in this class is to try to understand when there are such poverty traps, and when, in fact, maybe there are no, it's not so obvious. And for that, we have to understand what creates the conditions for such poverty trap to emerge. So what I want to do today is we are going to delve in on one example of one particular poverty trap and how that could work, which is going to be the fact that we are physical, biological bodies. But what we're going to go over as the mechanism, it's going to carry us during the entire class. We're going to have to be looking for the same type of conditions. So I want to start with a story of someone that I met. I met him, some guy called Pak Sollin. Pak means Mr. Sollin. So that people in Indonesia don't really have a first name and a last name. They just have a name. And so, for example, Mrs. So-and-so is Ibu. I would be Ibu Esther, for example. So this guy is Pak Sollin. And I met him in a village in Indonesia, in Java, which is one of the richest part of Indonesia. This is the main island, the most densely populated, in the summer of 2008. The summer of 2008 was, probably for you, it's already ancient history. It's before the great collapse of the world economy and stuff. One of the key events at the time, for the developing countries in particular, was that the food prices were very high. There has been, basically since 2005, food prices have increased enormously in the world for reasons that are not fully understood. And then they collapsed again after when the whole economy went berserk, the world economy went away, the food prices also collapsed, and they have started to increase again. Part of the hunger that you see now in Egypt, Tunisia, etc., all over the Middle East, part of it is fueled by a re-increase in the food prices, which are almost reaching the 2008 level. For people in urban areas, this is, of course, immediately threaten their livelihood because they don't produce food, they buy food. So as soon as the food prices increases, that immediately affects them. So 2008, the summer of 2008, beginning of 2008, 2007, you had this kind of food riots. You observed this kind of food riots, nothing like we are seeing now in Egypt, but discontent in various urban centers in urban areas. And generally, people were wondering what was happening with the food prices. What people have been thinking is that there are several factors that are responsible for the increase of the food prices. One is there are many more people in China and India who are making more money. And as they are making more money, not only they eat more, but more than that, they eat more meat. And it turns out that to produce 1,000 calories of meat, you need much more grain than to produce 1,000 calories of grain. That may sound strange, but it turns out that a cow is not a very efficient way to transform the calories from grain into calories that we eat. The cow starts by losing a lot of it, etc. So to produce 1,000 calories of cows, you need much more than 1,000 calories worth of grain. So as China and India is becoming richer and eating more meat, then there is a demand for more grains. That's one. The second thing that is happening is biofuels. With the increase in the world prices of fuel, there is more and more demand for biofuels. So entire strips of Brazil have been covered into maize that is being used to make ethanol. A third thing is oil is actually an input into the production of food because oil is a very important input in the production of fertilizer. So as the price of oil increases, the price of fertilizer increases, and therefore the price of food increases. So all of these factors are fundamental forces, which explains why after the short dip right after the crisis, the food prices again started to increase. So that's sort of the backdrop of my visit to this village in Indonesia, and I met this guy. And he was all alone. He had a small dingy little house, and he was a bit depressed, or very depressed. And why was he depressed? Well, he was depressed because he was all alone at home. And he was all alone at home because his wife had gone to the city to start working as a maid. His son, his oldest son, had also gone to the city to start working as an apprentice on a construction site. And the two young kids were with the grandparents. So he was all alone. He didn't have anything in his house. He didn't do all that much, and he wasn't happy. So the question is, why did that happen? Why was he not working? And what he explained to me is that he was not working because he didn't have a job. And he didn't have a job because when the fertilizer prices increased, the farmers that used to employ him decided that they had to do something to cut costs. They weren't very sure whether they were going to be able to sell their outputs, and they were facing those increases in expenditure. So they decided they had to cut cost. And so they could have done one of two things. What could they have done? Yeah.
They could have cut wages, or they could have cut the number of people employed.
Right, they could have cut wages, or they could have cut the number of people who worked for them. So of course, if they had cut wages, they still would have a job. But instead, they cut employment. And why did they cut employment rather than cut wages? Well, his theory was that if they had cut wages, his wages would have been so low that he would not have been able to buy enough food, especially as the food prices were rising at the same time. With the equivalent of 1 day of wage, that would have been too little to sustain himself, to be strong enough to actually work for a whole day. So seeing that, the employer, instead of cutting the wage and therefore making him unable to work, then you give a wage of someone, let's say, 1,000 rupees. 1,000 rupees is not enough to get yourself energetic for a full day of work. So you've spent your 1,000 rupees, but the person can't feed himself for a day of work. You get nothing out of him, so there is no point.